A few weeks ago, news broke that Disney were desperately looking to court the Gen Z male audience. Now, before we begin, it's worth noting that the reporting specifically pointed to boys between the ages of 13 and 28, which would put the target market on the cusp of the younger Gen Z and the older Gen Alpha audiences by most standard metrics, but the boundaries between generations are often blurred, so hey, who knows. The key takeaway, though, is that Disney have made it clear that they want to make movies and television that attract a young male audience. This was immediately interesting to me, because it answered the question that had been percolating through my subconscious every time I'd sat through a block of trailers over the past 5 months. How the hell is Jared Leto still working? Okay, not that question, but it did answer one of the questions that had been percolating through my subconscious. Why in the name of goodness are they making another Tron movie? Don't get me wrong here. I am very fond of both Tron and Tron Legacy. I think Tron Ares actually looks kind of fun. These movies are made for me. I mean, come on. Tron Legacy features Michael Sheen cosplaying as David Bowie, ejaculating lasers all over Daft Punk. It should be illegal how much that movie is for me. I think that's technically my sexual orientation. The problem is, looking at the box office of the earlier Tron movies, they seem to be made exclusively for me. Why on earth would Disney be spending hundreds of millions of dollars to make a Lego sequel to an underperforming Lego sequel from 15 years ago that was itself an underperforming Lego sequel to an underperforming film from 28 years before that? How could that be profitable for the Walt Disney Corporation? The answer, contained in that report I just mentioned, is very simple. This is what Disney thinks is going to appeal to young male moviegoers. So, as an older male moviegoer who is kinda into Tron Ares, I thought it was worth taking a look at Disney's long history of trying and failing to court the young male demographic. Why the studio fails at this, how it learns all the wrong lessons from its failures, and why those efforts ultimately end up causing more harm than good. No spoiler warning this week. We can just get Tron with it. Sorry, I suspect a lot of people were offended by that last pun, and I suggest that they simply build up bridges and get over it. Don't worry, I've got dozens of these. I could just light cycle through them.
Take that program to the holding pit!
Before we delve into this, it's probably worth acknowledging something very obvious. Disney is a massively successful corporation. They took a full fifth of the global box office last year, a whole quarter of this year's box office to date. Disney was the most successful studio at the summer box office this year, and Big Jim has yet to unleash Avatar upon the world. They're also the first of the legacy studios to find a road to profitability in streaming, having their first full year of streaming profitability this year, even if their path to doing that was simply to stop making massively expensive Marvel and Star Wars shows that it seemed like nobody was actually watching. And on the other hand, despite all the doomsaying, the kids actually seem to love going to the movies. Gen Alpha love theaters more than Gen Z, but Gen Z enjoys theaters more than Millennials or Gen X. According to NATO, and that's the National Association of Theater Owners, not the, other one, among 10 to 24-year-olds, going to see a movie on opening weekend was the #1 preferred activity, regardless of time and money. Studies also suggest that Gen Z enjoy theaters as a shared communal experience. They like big event movies. As such, maybe it's not the end of the world if Disney aren't dominating with the young male audience. Maybe it's okay for other studios to run the table with that demographic, such as Universal with Five Nights at Freddy's, or Warner Brothers with a Minecraft movie. Disney don't need to own everything. Maybe it's okay for other studios to have their own specialties. After all, one of the big challenges facing Disney's attempt to court young men is that the demographic loves horror movies and comedies, and these are not areas in which Disney tend to operate. Thanks in large part to their animated division, Disney have a long-standing lock on the young female demographic, and the company has long struggled to gain a similar foothold with boys. Disney has made a lot of money off girls. The first American movie to cross $1 billion this year was their Lilo and Stitch remake. Last year, both Moana 2 and Inside Out 2 crossed $1 billion. Given how rocky the company's flagship superhero franchise has been lately, it's good that Disney have this sewn up, that they do this thing better than anybody else. Because, let's face it, historically, one thing that Disney don't do well is appeal to young boys. And when the company makes a concerted effort to it doesn't work out. Over the past quarter century, Disney's efforts to appeal to young boys have all ultimately backfired in catastrophic ways that have had profound long-term consequences for both the company and the larger industry as a whole. The company has sabotaged its own brands. During the 1990s, for example, Disney Animation was considered untouchable, enjoying a string of massive commercial and critical hits known as the Disney Renaissance.
Look at this stuff. Isn't it neat?
Beauty and the Beast was nominated for Best Picture at the Academy Awards, a surprise that many analysts credit with the introduction of the Best Animated Film category a few years later. However, despite the fact that some of these movies are consciously designed around boys like Aladdin or The Lion King, Disney grew anxious about the idea that they were becoming known for their Disney princesses. So, at the turn of the millennium, the brand took a strong pivot towards boys, with movies like Hercules and Tarzan. And while these movies have arguably been somewhat reclaimed, and Tarzan went on to win the Best Original Song Oscar for hot young heartthrob Phil Collins, these movies were received as disappointments at the time. They are now widely regarded as the end of the Disney Renaissance. The studio turned hard towards animated films that were aimed at a young male demographic: Dinosaur, Treasure Planet, and Brother Bear. And look, many of those movies are beloved by people who came of age watching them, but they were not financially or critically successful. This was the period in which the studio's animation wing collapsed, closing their animation studio down in Florida and eventually completely abandoning conventional two-dimensional animation. And while there were certainly other factors at play, such as the emergence of CGI animation or a trend towards irony in movies like Shrek, it is no exaggeration to say that this pivot completely altered the trajectory of mainstream American animation. It feels like the studio eventually just gave up on crafting animated movies for boys, just buying Pixar and then drafting in lots of Hug and Lasseter to come in and reconfigure Disney's animation division. The company embraced computer-generated animation, and it pivoted back towards movies aimed towards girls. Films like Frozen, Moana, and Tangled. Even then, though, that anxiety hung on. Tangled was originally supposed to be titled Rapunzel, but it rebranded because the company worried that boys wouldn't want to see it. After the studio failed to reconfigure their animation department to appeal to boys, Disney decided to pivot its live-action blockbusters towards younger male viewers. Now there was some basis for this decision. The company had enjoyed massive success with Gore Verbinski's Pirates of the Caribbean, the studio's first PG-13 blockbuster. To this day, Pirates is perhaps Disney's most consistent homegrown live-action franchise, and there's a reason they seem to keep going back to it. This turn really kicked off in 2010 with the doubleheader of Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time and Tron Legacy. Because boys like video games is the assumption the studio is making here, I guess. Prince of Persia debuted third in its opening weekend, and you don't need to be a box office analyst to know that that's not great. Still, Prince of Persia and Tron Legacy were unqualified successes compared to the triple whammy of John Carter in 2012, The Lone Ranger in 2013, and Tomorrowland in 2015. Disney lost $200 million on John Carter, $160 million on The Lone Ranger, and $140 million on Tomorrowland. So I guess they only really had to make like 7 more of those movies before one of them would turn out to be profitable. Understandably, the studio very quickly switched direction. Much like the company had made up for lost ground in animation by leaning hard into their purchase of Pixar, Disney's live-action blockbusters came to rely heavily on their purchases of Lucasfilm and Marvel Studios. As this happened, the studio became a lot more conservative. They began releasing fewer, more expensive movies. The studio went from releasing 23 movies in 2009 to releasing just 12 in 2017. This not only narrowed the kinds of movies being made and released, it also put tremendous pressure on those that were. It was no longer enough for a movie to earn a couple of $100 million. $1 billion became the new benchmark of success. And where Disney led, the industry followed. Of course, this approach worked, at least for a while. Marvel Studios was a hugely popular brand with younger millennial men. However, in recent years, it's become less appealing to young men. Online rage merchants will argue that this is because the company's Marvel and Star Wars brands have pivoted to women. Sorry, I'm seeing the word women just flash up on screen boldly. This is very obviously not the case. The problem is simply that these franchises have been running for decades at this point. At a certain point, young men stop being young. If you look at the audience demographics for the opening weekends of recent films like Wakanda Forever, Thunderbolts, or Indiana Jones: The Dial of Destiny, you'll see that older men are actually still significantly over-indexed in the audiences for those films. In fact, Disney themselves have tacitly acknowledged this by pivoting their Marvel and Star Wars brands to streaming. These are franchises squarely aimed at the people earning money in the household. It's not young Gen Z men who are paying for the family Disney Plus account. Even the shows within these franchises ostensibly aimed at younger viewers, such as Skeleton Crew and Star Wars, are still filtered through the lens of an older audience's nostalgia. Skeleton Crew might be a kids show, but it's a kids show for people who were kids in 1982. You can try to tailor these brands to appeal to younger viewers, but you are somewhat limited by the fact that most kids don't want their parents' hand-me-downs. They want new, or at least new to them, brands and properties that they can make their own. These don't have to be entirely novel franchises, but it helps for them to be at least fresh in cinemas. Barbie is a great example of this, an existing brand that was new to theaters. The Super Mario Bros. Movie and a Minecraft movie were simply new cinematic properties that didn't feel like the results of decades of cultural fracking. While each new Marvel and Star Wars movie feels beholden to years and years of what came before, most of the animated Disney movies that appeal to young girls are accessible on their own terms. When the studio did try to Marvelize their animated features with Wish, a movie that is, I kid you not, about the star upon which Disney characters wish, that movie was a massive critical and commercial bomb. For a studio worried about being unable to appeal to Gen Z men, they are the rare major studio without their own games division, instead outsourcing their intellectual properties to third parties. Given that so many of the movies that have broken out among Gen Z and Gen Alpha men are video game adaptations like the Super Mario Bros. Movie, Five Nights at Freddy's, a Minecraft movie, this is the most obvious misstep the company has made and continues to make in trying to court those viewers. And to be clear, to circle back to the argument made at the start of this video, that's okay. Disney have their own model of development and production, and it works very well for them in other contexts. Disney are not willing to spend the time or the money to grow internal properties, and historically have just tended to save time by buying up other brands and then running them into the ground as the general audience ages out of brand loyalty. The problem is that the studio's desperation in chasing this young male demographic leads it to pivot hard into areas where it has no firm footing, and then its inevitable and predictable failures push it and the larger industry harder into self-destructive cycles. When it comes to appealing to Gen Z men, for Disney it might just be game over. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was The Backdrop.